Well, good evening again. I thought it was maybe the snow that was fouling things up, but there's a call coming in for for the class. Are you calling about the class? All right. Little technical delay. I hope you're all still there, patiently waiting, um, because I'm still here and I'm going to begin. Perhaps it was that I took a few minutes for our pray-in. Sorry that you missed that, but I think we will continue. Um, And the first thing I'd like to do is just to give you a brief review of what we covered last week. And you remember that Elijah, pre still small voice, and Elisha, post still small voice, did a miracle with widows who were in dire straits, as widows were in that time. Elijah was able to demonstrate the law. It's not enough just to understand the law, have to be able to demonstrate the law. Elisha already knew how to demonstrate the law, so he was able to teach the widow, who was a woman of substance, even though she was a widow. And the difference is that when you demonstrate the law one challenge at a time, that's not the same thing as building a consciousness of abundance. And we're going to see that even more fully tonight, because we have the principle of wherever substance is at all of substance is. So no matter how little you have, if you have developed the consciousness of infinite abundance, you can start with a small amount and bless it into existence. So there are a series of stories on feeding the crowds of hungry thoughts. You remember Moses in the wilderness, Exodus 16, where it reads, "And the whole congregation of Israel murmured against Moses and Aaron," Moses representing the law and Aaron the high priest, "in the wilderness, and said to them, Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we eat by the flesh pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." Now keep in mind, they have just been liberated from the darkness of bondage in Egypt. And they've gone a little way, and already they're wanting to go back. They were wishing they could die in Egypt. So Moses, he has to deal with these people who at every challenge cry out to him, and then he cries out to God. But keep in mind, the God of Moses is far away. It's not that still small voice within. he has contact with God, and he simply gives them the instructions. And here's what the Lord says: Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may prove them whether they will walk in our law or not. It's an amazing story. And what we want to focus on is developing a consciousness that we have locked up within us of infinite abundance, of healing energy, of everything we could possibly need, require, or desire to fulfill God's wish for us, which is to be a visible expression of the Christ. So you would think, at least in Abraham came to the conclusion that God provided all. You remember when he was about to sacrifice Isaac, an animal appeared, a ram appeared in the bushes, so he didn't sacrifice his joy, his son. He could sacrifice the animal instead. And because of that discovery of Abraham, who represents faith, God got a new name, not just Jehovah, but Jehovah Jireh. God provides. Now, it reminds me a bit of Elijah, whom you remember, because this is really recently for us, that he, after this great victory over the Baal prophets, won this contest, and he was feeling pretty good about himself, but he had to flee because of Jezebel. And on the way up to the mountain, he prayed that he would die, just like those people, just like those unredeemed thoughts of the Israelites. He wanted to die. He thought it was over, and he wished that he was no better than his forefathers, and take me away. But even there, he had enough understanding of the law to receive first substance, and then the instructions that just to continue on for 40 days and 40 nights up to the top of the mountain. So he was sustained for the remainder of the journey, and then at the top he received the insight that God was within him, and that made all the difference. He was then guided, as you recall, to anoint Hazael, anoint Jehu, and anoint Elisha. The reason that he had to start with Elisha is that he had to demonstrate to himself before he could teach the new Elijah, whom we call Elijah. So there was a difference too, because Elijah, his lesson was that God was in the still small voice. He was still God's champion, as he said. But the way he expressed that was in a totally different method. And so he had to go back into the world and face the world again and use his newfound consciousness to uplift and to sanctify. So after that, we come to a similar miracle where Elisha feeds 100 men with 20 loaves of barley and fresh ears of grain in the sack. Let's see. Here, this is found in 2 Kings 4:42 to 44. A man came from Baal Shalala, bringing the man of God. Baal Shalala means believing in appearances. Bringing the man of God bread of the first fruits. First fruits are always the best. 20 loaves of barley and fresh ears of grain in the sack. Barley, there were only 3 grains in existence at that time. One of them was barley. That was the poor man. That's what the poor man used to make bread. Wheat was the prime. They also had spelt. And Elisha said, "Give to the men that they may eat." Just like that. Give it to the men that they may eat. But the servant said, "How am I to set this before 100 men?" So he repeated, "Give them to the men that they may eat. For thus says the Lord." So apparently it wasn't necessary to explain to them why they had to do it, just to trust and to go ahead and give the men. The men represent thoughts. All right. It's the mind that likes to know why. Before I will receive this guidance, I want to know why. Why do I have to do that? And so those kinds of doubts have to get erased. They shall eat and have some left. Not only will they eat, but they will have leftovers with which to build a consciousness of infinite substance. So he set it before them, and they ate, and they had some left, according to the word of the Lord. So this is Elisha. Now 100, the numbers are important. 1 references the divine. 10 is the individual soul, which is balanced thinking and feeling. And 100, this is the word of God. So if God says, give these 100 loaves, give these 100 men 20 loaves, you just do it. There's no explanation given. But when we get to Jesus, we find the explanation. Because it's very similar story. I also want to point out the similarity of names. Okay, Elijah and Elisha, practically the same. Joshua, who replaced Moshe, in the wilderness, was a forerunner of Yeshua, whose name is Jesus. It's the same thing. So when you're looking to find the spiritual meaning behind the words, names are important, locations are important, numbers are important, and action phrases are important. So what were the instructions here? Give them. In order to prime the pump to receive, one has to give first. Right. So there's a law that came from the wisdom of Elijah that was passed on to Elisha. And so in the process, one can fulfill one's desires through giving first, starting that circulation of giving and receiving, and at the same time building a consciousness of giving, that there's always something to give. But when we get to Jesus, we get more a sense of the mechanics of how this works. This is found in John 6, 1 through 14. Now, Jesus has been doing a lot of healing, and he and his disciples decide to go over to the Sea of Tiberias, which is on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, and a multitude followed him. That's a multitude of thoughts, 5,000 thoughts. Every time you add a zero, you intensify the 5. First thing Jesus did, Jesus went up on the mountain and there sat down with his disciples. So he became quiet. He sat down with his disciples. His disciples are those inner faculties. Everything has to become still. Lifting up his eyes, gazing at a higher plane, he gave thanks. All right. It's interesting, I think, that we are so willing to give thanks for what we have received, but how much faith do we have that we can give thanks ahead of time? So he lifted up his eyes, and seeing that a multitude was at hand, coming to him, Jesus said to Philip, "How are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" Now Jesus knew, but he asked Philip, the disciple that represents power. It's testing that faculty of spiritual power. And what does Philip say? He says, 200 denarii, that wouldn't even be enough to, buy even a little bit. And keep in mind, they're way out of any city or town. They can't just run to the supermarket. 200 denarii is a year's wages in the world. And then Andrew is important because he's Peter's brother. It is Andrew's strength that supports faith, that keeps it from wavering. And Andrew says, yeah, but here's this boy who has 5 loaves and 2 fish. And so there we have something to work with. If there is something visible, we know that infinite substance is behind it. Also, 5 and 2 equals 7. So we know that something is going to manifest. 2 fish what do those two fish represent? Two not divine ideas. And one of them is no, and the other is yes. We have to be discerning enough to be able to see truth in all circumstances, and to be able to deny that which is false. And the 5 loaves, well, here again, we have bread. That's hardly enough for 5,000. If you had 5,000 people coming for dinner, would you give thanks that enough food would be provided for them? But fortunately, these are not people. These are hungry thoughts. And so even Andrew has a little bit of a waver here, and he says, but what is so little when there are so many? Jesus said, here's step 1, make the people sit down. There has to be stillness. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So only the quiet thoughts got the substance. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, gather up the fragments left over. And they gathered them up. Gather up the fragments left over, that nothing may be lost. So from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, when the people saw the sign which he had done, they said, this is indeed the prophet who has come into the world. So it sounds like a very simple formula. Jesus did not wait for the miracle to happen before he gave thanks. He gave thanks ahead of time. He knew it could happen not here on the material plane, but on this higher plane. He looked up there and saw that the faculty of power representing Philip had no answer, only that kind of sarcastically saying, even 200 denarii, a whole year's wages, wouldn't buy enough food. That is true on the physical level, but it has no value if you're using spiritual law. So wherever substance is, all of substance is. Wherever there is any substance at all of substance is. But you have to bless it, give thanks for it, and that was it. And then you distribute it. And here again, the fragments left over represent the building of a consciousness of infinite substance. This is the one miracle, so-called miracle. A miracle isn't really something that happens outside of a law. It's called a miracle because in human consciousness it can't happen. But in spiritual consciousness it's quite natural. And so the fragments, so every time you step out in faith, give thanks for something before it has appeared, knowing that it can happen. You are building up a consciousness of infinite substance. If doubts come up, you have those 2 fish, those 2 ideas, as Jesus said, These are the two important words, yes and no, to distinguish between what is truth and what is not. I have two little weights that I have upon my desk. Somebody gave them to me as a gift, and it has yes and no in 4 or 5 different languages. It's very, very fun. Okay, so there we have a formula for manifesting a great deal out of a very small bit. And I'm going to leave that for now and go on to healing. So let's see what happens with Naaman the leper. Okay, now interestingly, if you look up Naaman, his name means agreeable, pleasant, harmonious. And you would think a leper, agreeable. So, what is a leper? According to Charles Fillmore, it is one which has lost connection with the life force, and that has totally lost its vitality. And lepers, of course, were outside of the city. They were not allowed in. If they were healed, they were healed at the temple, because the priests were considered the healers in those days. And so what agreeable and pleasant and amiable and all those wonderful words, how that can be applied to a leper is when Naaman, who was the captain in the Syrian army representing will, comes under the influence of spirit via a little Israelite girl who was captured in one of those wars. And she's the one who passes on the word about Elisha. And then when that will is under the direction of spirit, represented by Elisha, the consciousness is extremely pleasant and harmonious. A personal will, a willful will, is one that has a lot of ambition for oneself, a lot of attainments, a lot of sort of, look at me, I am so important, look at my education, look at my bank account, look at all these outer things that the world values. But then when that will comes under the direction of spirit and surrenders to the will of God, well, then it is purified. Now, so what does Elisha do for Naaman? He does not even come out to meet him. He gives the instructions via his servant, which is to go wash in the Jordan 7 times. 7 is important. Okay? 7 means you complete the cleansing. And the Jordan is the river of life. It's the vitality. And so Naaman is almost indignant that he would ask him to do such a thing. We have better rivers in, would you think that if you went to some high-powered specialist and said, oh, go swim in this pool? And here he had come in his self-importance, expecting to be acknowledged and, and have some kind of special treatment from Elisha. Whereas in fact, he is told via messenger to go bathe in the Jordan 7 times. So he goes off in a huff. And here's what happens. But Naaman became angry and went away, saying, I thought that for me he would surely come out and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, and he would wave his hand over the spot and cure the leprosy. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? And Damascus is a beautiful, beautiful place. Could I not wash in them and be clean? He turned and went away in a rage. But his servants approached him and said, Father, if the prophet had commanded you to do something difficult, would you not have done it? How much more, when all he said to you was, wash and be clean? So he went down and immersed himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God. His flesh was restored, like the flesh of a young boy, and he was clean. So there's a recipe for healing leprosy in Leviticus 14. 2 essential oils, cedar wood and it's either hyssop or sandalwood, but those are like hyssop, the universal purifier, cedar wood, the highest oil in sesquiterpenes, an oil that deprograms all the wrong beliefs that one can have. Now that recipe is not quoted here and it's not used, but there was an understanding that essential oils had the capacity to delete error thoughts and then to also restore the cells to normal functioning. But the old materialistic beliefs and attitudes, unprocessed emotions, all of that has to be cleansed before our Naaman consciousness can be harmonious and amicable and agreeable. That's found in 2 Kings 4:38 through 41, if you would like to go over it for yourself. And since we are short of time, I would like to just mention a couple of very sort of puzzling miracles that take some deep contemplation to understand them. And the first one that I'm going to talk about is the pottage that is poisoned. Okay, now this is not deliberate. It was an act of ignorance. And this is found in 2 Kings 4:38 to 41. I'll just do this one, and I will touch on the second one, and then we can go to questions as usual, and then we will finish up with some directives, some questions that we can ask about our own journey. So, here's the story Elisha came again to Gilgal. Now, that was the first step where Elisha was tested to see if he was going to stick with Elijah or whether he was going to stay in a more comfortable place. We often choose to stay in a comfort zone rather than to take a risk when the outcome is unknown. And so he comes to Gilgal, where there was a famine in the land. Again, a famine, a lack of visible substance. And as the sons of the prophets were sitting before him, he said to his servant, "Set on the great pot and boil pottage for the sons of the prophets." Okay, this is kind of a gourmet dish, this pottage, consisting of vegetables and grains and sometimes meat. However, here's what happened. One of them went out into the field to gather herbs and found a wild vine and gathered it from his lap full of wild gourds, and came and cut them up into the pot of pottage, not knowing what they were. And they poured out for the men to eat. But while they were eating of the pottage, they cried out, "O man of God, there is death in the pot." And they could not eat it. Elisha said, "Then bring meal." And he threw it into the pot and said, "Pour out for the men, that they may eat." And there was no harm in the pot. So had to do a little research on this and a little bit of thinking about this. And first off, the operative word here is field. These people in the story were out in Gilgal, which is a place of purification. And so to go outside in a field is to go outside of the realm of the spiritual realm. Okay, so that's the word you want to latch onto. So you go outside and you don't know. You are ignorant of what is growing out there. And according to the culture of that time, these wild gourds and wild herbs, there was a thing called wild cucumbers that were pretty much like we think of wild mushrooms, that some are good to eat and some aren't good to eat. But not knowing, they just thought, "Oh, these are herbs." And unknowingly, we sometimes violate a law, right? And so without really knowing what they were doing, they cut all this up and put it into this gourmet dish. And you're saying, well, why put meal in it? Well, the pottage had grain in it, and meal is ground up grain. It's flour, right? It's what they made bread out of. And so whatever that means to you, my take on it is that it was revealed to Elisha in that moment what to do. He's a prophet, and he has developed his ability to hear guidance in the still small voice. Another perhaps possibility is that if you have something contaminating in consciousness, you add a little purity to it and it is erased. So in putting in meal, which is, as I said, ground up flour that they made bread out of, substance, you add some pure substance, and pure substance cleanses those herbs that are making people sick. So if you have questions on that, I'll do my best in just a moment. And I want to talk to you about the axe head. That floats. This is another, and this also is an accident. Nobody did this on purpose. And this is found in 2 Kings 6. I should also mention that look at the number of the chapters, and here again, look at the number of the chapter and the verses. That wonderful Bible teacher from Princeton, Michael Segru, said, every word in the Bible is music. There is no noise, and that includes the numbers of the chapters and verses. There are people who say, what, numbers? Anyway, this is about the axe head. And here's what was happening. The place where they were coming together was too small. And they said, let us go to the Jordan, where each of us can get a pole, and let us build a place there for us to meet. Now, the pole here is coming from the Jordan. Vitality. This is God life. It's the river of life. So they hoped to find some poles there. And he said, go. Then one of them said, won't you please come with your servants? Okay, they feel the need for some security here. I will, Elisha replied, and he went with them. They went to the Jordan and began to cut down trees. As one of them was cutting down a tree, the iron axe head fell into the water. Oh no, my lord, he cried out. It was borrowed. The man of God asked, where did it fall? When he showed him the place, Elisha cut a stick and threw it there and made the iron float. Lift it out, he said. Then the man reached out his hand and took it. It's really the same idea as the poison stew, all right? And it all has to do with the Jordan, where the material came from. So he lost something that he had borrowed through carelessness, through what? But he had borrowed it, so he was in debt. And so, again, my feeling is that Elisha knew exactly what to tell him to do, and to put one of these little slivers of wood, one stick of wood, into the Jordan to give energy for that heavy iron piece of the axe to rise to the surface. Here, Elisha gives no explanations, and I think that's where our own discernment comes in. I feel certain that Elisha, once he knew where the spot was in the river, that he could very precisely put the stick that would draw the axe head to the surface. And if you have some ideas, of course, I will welcome them. I want to remind you that the whole point of studying this is to develop our own capacity as a prophet. A prophet speaks truth. A prophet is like God's mouthpiece. It's not your own opinion. It is wisdom that maybe makes no sense on an outer level, but what is truth? And you go ahead and you speak truth to the power that appears to be in the outer world. Now, real prophets, are a combination of two faculties. We have seen this in Elijah, in Elisha. Both of them have developed, well, Elijah in the process of developing love, which is our way of connecting to the source, and discernment or wisdom, which is our ability to see from that place, from that connection to the source, to see and then discern. Truth, yes, non-truth. Those two faculties are featured in all of these stories of Elijah and Elisha. Elisha is able to explain more. He gives us more clues than Elijah, who has to demonstrate to himself first so that he can be an example in teaching others. And I would say, that Elijah representing the prophets, Moses representing the law, Jesus representing the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. And so we get a complete picture of the law, which is now, remember in Jeremiah, written upon our hearts. They couldn't follow that Mosaic law. That was too hard. It made people crazy, and there were 613 of them. But Jesus reduced it down to love God, love your neighbor, love life, love yourself, see your connection to all of life. And that's what it comes down to, a consciousness of being connected to an infinite source and projecting your wisdom and your love from that place. And so there's one other thing. The prophets are called. They are called, and we see a variety of ways here in which prophets are called. Moses was tending sheep when he was called. It's a very quiet, very highly valued occupation, tending sheep. And he, while in that quiet, contemplative state, a state of simple awareness, he heard his name called from a bush. a burning bush. That is the word of God, fire. Fire is a symbol of God. And that's when he received his calling. Oh, you have to go back to Egypt. You killed that Egyptian. Now you've got to go back and you have to liberate everybody and bring them into the promised land. Oh, wow. Okay, so that's how he received his calling. Elijah, and it can happen like this. Just one day you suddenly know what it is. And it was focused on this issue of the breakdown of monotheism, that Ahab and Jezebel had corrupted the religion. They had foreign gods. They had converted half of Israel to Baal worship. And Elijah just appears out of nowhere. Just starts out. Look at his name. Elijah the Tishbite, the speaker of truth in Gilead. He is there to speak, to be a witness to the truth. We are all called to be a witness to the truth. And what about Elisha? Well, Elisha, as you know, he was he was plowing. Now, Elisha was a man of substance. He had a lot to give up in order to follow Elijah. And he was tested every step along the way. He had the mantle. He was given the mantle, and he took it up, but he was tested at several stages to be sure, to be absolutely sure of his commitment. Okay. And then we have Jesus and his disciples. Jesus called his disciples, and his disciples were a ragtag bunch of mostly illiterate, definitely unschooled group that had no vested interest in the status quo. They were quite willing to follow Jesus, who had a vision of a better life. And so I think that we might do well to ask ourselves, do you feel you have been called to a spiritual life? How seriously do you take it? Are you like Elijah, where you take up your calling with great zeal, and then have to sort of fall back as you have taken on too much too soon before you had the consciousness to be able to do it? Or are you like Elisha, and you just without question follow and have, even though you have to give up everything in the material world? Those oxen, they represented wealth, 24 of them. And he was using them to plow. It was his livelihood. And without hesitation, he goes to follow Elijah. And the disciples, well, they, as I said, they had no vested interest in the status quo, so they were quite quick to follow. But anyway, let's ask ourselves some questions, and ask yourself about how great of a commitment have you made. Is it seek ye first the kingdom of God? Is it you feel more comfortable believing in God and something else still, even knowing that you create a conflict within yourself if you are not totally committed to the one power and one presence. I think since, if you will allow me, we can stay online for a few more minutes because I haven't given anyone a chance to call in. So if anyone has any questions or comments, please do call in, and my apologies for the lateness and for the technological, but I didn't change anything on the computer, and suddenly it worked. So there you go. 816-301-6204 if anyone would like to call. If not, I will pose some more questions to you. But the turning point for all is once you experience that joy of even touching the transcendent, even a little bit, that is what gives you the vision of a kingdom on earth, of more possibilities than what you're living in the material world. I had some questions that I was going to ask you. But maybe I already asked them. I am considering I'm going to do some streaming, but on the first Saturday, and I probably won't stream this, but I'm going to do a Christmas healing workshop. I do this every year because the whole journey of the awakening of the Christ takes place in chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. So if you want an overview of the journey to awakening, there it is. That takes a very little space in the Bible, but the whole rest of that gospel is about how you bring it forth. What do we do with that awakening? But anyway, that's a whole nother story. Also, I was thinking of doing a series of Jesus parables. I have done this before, but there are many, many parables, and it's one of the main teaching methods of Jesus, because it's through a parable that you, particularly in those times, parables were, a way of communicating ideas. We don't have that rich language which lends itself to metaphor and to symbol so much, but they did. And so I think it's a very worthwhile study to see how Jesus used every moment as a teaching moment. And the parables, there were parables of the kingdom. That was a big, big category. Parables of the kingdom. There were nature parables, calming the storm and walking on water. And a few miscellaneous, there were healing parables, of course, 26 of them, at least, of individual healing parables. And what is communicated through parables is not just a result. It's about what consciousness, what spiritual laws do we have to internalize in order for this to become a visible reality. And despite the fact that I have promised not to repeat the phone number, I will give you one last chance to call maybe some people gave up because of the lateness, but in any case, I will hear. And if nobody calls in the next few minutes, I will simply wish you happy Thanksgiving and happy scripture reading. Make this time of winter a time to go inward. And I became very aware today that winter was here with 2 inches of snow. But it's a time when nature becomes quiet. It's a very quiet time, a time to build a fire, a time to go within, and to ask yourselves, what is my next step? And to what level am I willing to make a commitment to an awakening? What are the tools that I can use? And then the journey actually in the Bible, it's amazing. It looks like it's not a big journey. It's a lifetime journey for us. But the journey in the Bible of the awakening ends on Epiphany, when that's the 12th day of Christmas, when all 12 faculties are awakening. Another course series that I've considered is one on teaching you how to interpret with metaphysics, keeping within the context of the story. And you don't have to have a huge vocabulary. And just simply starting simply, like words that pretty much always mean the same thing: mountain, house, field, things like that, that give you, and the action phrases are so meaningful. So from one place to another is a change in consciousness. A change in name is a change in consciousness. So that's another possibility. And the third possibility that I have actually had a request for, and now it's slipped my mind. Of course it would. It's one of those nights. Anyway, so those are the choices. And if it is past 8:30, and so I'm thinking that either you got tired or gave up on the broadcast, or that you have no questions. But please email or text if you were able to get the broadcast. And of course, any comments or questions are always welcome. And so if you are there, just close your eyes for a moment so we can conclude in a moment of quiet as we begin that journey of our own awakening, or continue on that journey, renewing our commitment. And for just a moment in the silence, let us realize that not only all of us who are part of this class, but everyone, everywhere, is one on this level in the silence. And so it is. And if you would like to support New Foundation Unity, I invite you to visit the website, or if you would like, send a check to New Foundation Unity. The address is on my website, newfoundationunity.org. And God bless you, and good night.